Welcome to Transformational Blueprints, the podcast that's here to tackle the big question. Why do so many transformation programs fall short? And what can we do about it? I'm Mario Michaels, founder and director of Synaxia Group, and I'm thrilled to have you join me. In this series, we go beyond theory, bringing you first-hand stories and insights from some of the world's top architecture and transformation leaders. It's all about sharing real-world lessons, sparking fresh ideas, and giving back to the architecture community. So whether you're looking to learn, be inspired, or stay ahead of the curve, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive in together. Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking to Whynde Kuehn about the business architecture edge and how organizations can get an edge by using it, how the companies that are on the edge are using it strategically. So really great topic. For those of you that don't know Whynde, you must be living underneath a rock because she's absolutely everywhere. She's recognized globally as a highly sought after pioneer, thought leader, educator, and advisor in strategy execution, transformation, and the intentional and sustainable design of organizations and business ecosystems, all underpinned by architecture. She has worked with an extensive array of organizations, including Fortune 500, global enterprises, government and non-profit organizations, startups across many sectors and initiatives. She also founded an online learning community called BizArch Mastery. We'll put the links in the show notes for all these, by the way. Co-founded the Business Architecture Guild, is a fellow with the Institute of Digital Transformation, and co-founded Women in Architecture. She's also finds time to write books. So she's written 2 books. So she's a well-known author, Strategy to Reality, and also The Execution Challenge. So Whynde, thank you so much for taking time out of what's evidently a busy schedule.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a joy and honor, and just so looking forward to this conversation with you. Thank you.
Good. Well, just to give our listeners a bit of context, tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are now and what you're currently doing.
Yes. So, I'm a bit of an accidental architect, which I think is a story for a whole lot of people. I'm actually a science person, so biology, chemistry. My master's is in sustainability. So I'm a big picture systemic thinker, but I found myself in business after deciding not to become a vet after many years. But how I started on this part of the journey was a 3-month temp job. I don't even think it was called business architecture, which progressed to leading enterprise-wide transformations top to bottom, which led to me running my own practice of 100 business architects, which led to what I do today, which is really a life's work and passion.
Wow. So, and what was the business where you did that, or was that in a variety of different businesses?
Variety of different businesses. I spent a lot of time in insurance and financial services, but also working in a lot of businesses, not just different industries, but as you were mentioning, government, startup, cross-sector initiatives, so different scales and focus. So I think that's also what has given me so much love for business architecture and its power and a well-roundedness of its application.
Absolutely. And we're going to come on to the cycle of business architecture, certainly what I've seen from a talent perspective as well. But we're going to start with a question from the previous guest. So how do you, as an architecture leader, stay relevant and effective in the face of disruption and transformational change?
I love it. I love that you have a previous guest conversation.
I've stolen it from another podcast, to be honest.
That is so cool. I love that. So staying sort of current and relevant, first of all, I think that people like us have this inherent secret weapon, which is a curiosity and a drive to learn and to explore. So with that sort of underpinning, I think it's just the regular flow of loving to learn, knowing we need to learn, and just soaking it up in every angle, from videos, podcasts. I also, for me, think that conferences and community are really big places where I learn and sort of keep building my edge and kind of stay very open-minded. But the other thing I want to say about this really great question and take it in a different direction is, But also, as architects, I also think that we need to be a strong foundation in the
Yeah.
face of disruption and transformational change, because we bring people back to, what are we trying to do? What is it we do today? And so I also think that's important when it looks like everything is changing, when the core is not always. Yeah.
Absolutely, and there's so much going on, and another guest that I had calls it the complexity crunch. The level of information and the level of change has gone so quickly these days, and is such a high volume that it's really easy for boards to go, oh, this AI, what are we doing with AI, and so on and so forth, the current topical challenge. And it's up to the architects to go, I will investigate that, but it's got to align to our business objectives. And if it doesn't, we're just going to have to move along. Not that it won't, but we're going to have to do something else which doesn't delay us and so on. Other than that growth mindset, and I think you mentioned a couple of things there around going to conferences and having an open mind, and I thought let's badge that as a growth mindset, I suppose. What do you think makes a great architect in today's world?
I think a lot of things, but what I won't put first is
Hmm.
like specific technology expertise, because we were just saying it's going to keep changing. We have to keep
Yeah.
learning, or like, the best mapper in the world. And I'm not trying to de-emphasize either of these things,
Yeah.
but in today's world, what I think we really need are being underpinned by our architectural mindsets,
Yep.
patterns, right? Big picture thinking, connecting the dots, and systemic thinking, of course,
Hmm.
right? Bringing that. And of course, we need to excel in our domain. So for me to excel in business architecture versus data architecture, something like that. But the communications, the human, the empathy, the storytelling are utterly essential, because, we need to help organizations see where they are, where they're going. We need to be able to communicate change,
Hmm.
and really relate to people, or all the brilliant architecture doesn't matter. So we have to be really good on the human side. And one other thing I will add, I think architects today, we also need to be leaders and change leaders. It's not
Hmm.
just doing what it's like also having a vision and being out on that edge and really helping to be part of the change.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot more architects or a lot more businesses hire transformational architects that are specific for a program of work, whether that's on an interim or a lot, it's a 5-year strategic program. We need a transformational architect that's got a bit of enterprise, a bit of business, a little bit of technology in there as well. The purple unicorn, as I like to call it. So we're going to move on to your speciality subject here, which is business architecture. So there's been a bit of a cycle in terms of business architecture, certainly from what I've seen in a talent perspective, where the requirements of businesses flip. Yes, we do need business architecture. Actually, no, we don't. We're going to get enterprise architecture to do that, or technology architects to do that. Oh no, now we need it again because we need to align to our business goals a little bit more. So I've seen in sort of 12 years, probably 2 cycles of demand over sort of a 2 to 3 year period, then a gap, and then another 2 to 3 year period, certainly in the UK. So I suppose probably a good place to start is, what is the actual true value of business architecture, and how can organizations leverage it effectively?
I love that so much. And if anybody would know the cycles, it is you. So true value, true vision for business architecture is, in a transformational context, it is relevant to compare back to something like a blueprint of your dream home,
Hmm.
because when you're making change, that's when it's important to say, this is where we are. This
Hmm.
is where we're going and what it's going to look like, so the entire organization can actually picture that future state. And then here's how we're going to get there in a coordinated way. So, the role of business architecture is really to bridge this gap between strategy, between big
Hmm.
transformational ideas, and the coordinated execution of it. And the challenge is that many organizations sort of skip over this step where we can understand the impact, architect the change together,
Hmm.
design the change together, and they just go from big idea to initiatives or solutions. And
Hmm.
that
Mm.
is where the execution challenges are born. They
Okay.
show up downstream, so
Hmm.
where it looks like we built something that was, redundant, or,
Hmm.
we have pet projects that we're funding, or we built, a really disconnected experience for people. The role of business architecture is really to bridge that gap between strategy and execution, help us see the future, and then shape the work around capabilities that bring
Hmm.
an enterprise together. So invest in capabilities instead of laundry lists of initiatives and solutions that we hope are going to add up to our transformational goals.
Okay. And then you have, if we're looking at transformational goals and then at enterprise level, which most transformation programs are, there's always been this overlap of business architecture and enterprise architecture, and not many people understand the difference between the two. Where do you sort of draw that line, I suppose, so there isn't that overlap, and the import that they both have important roles in their own right, right?
Absolutely. And I'm so deeply steeped in the business
Hmm.
architecture that, of course, I and my peers, like, we see a whole other world there. So
Yeah.
the way I think about this is, honestly, the contemporary practice of business architecture has become a bit of a Venn diagram,
Hmm.
where on one side it is part of strategic management, it's part of strategy execution, and we have business people
Yeah.
using the business architecture. On the other side, we have enterprise architecture, right? And so we also think about business architecture as a specialty, as part of the enterprise architecture umbrella. So, business architecture and business architects live in two worlds. So, where the overlap and partnership is kind of this space in the middle here, right? Where
Hmm.
we need to be able to get, again, idea into action using the business architecture and the rest of the architecture
Hmm.
domains to again create solution, create idea. But where I think things are different is that, and I find a lot of people that think there's only overlap do not see the left side. There's
Hmm.
so much work to be done in the strategy, in the direction space, or use of business architecture that doesn't even necessarily hit technology right away, like informing acquisitions, or
Hmm.
understanding compliance and framing. It's not that everything doesn't hit
Yeah.
technology, but there's a whole lot of business focused work that needs to happen, and like I said, other business people using the discipline as well. So I honestly can't, for a large organization, I'll say it
Mhm.
this way, I think you definitely need both roles
Both.
and need to work together, from strategy to execution and other scenarios.
And has that evolved over the years during your time? You've been in this world a long time. So has that evolved?
Yeah, how people work together, you mean?
Yes.
Most definitely. And, the reason why, honestly, I explain this as a Venn diagram is because I had such cognitive dissonance at one point in time, where I'd be talking to someone, from an enterprise architecture perspective, and everything they were saying about business architecture is right. And then I'd be talking to, a professor, someone in a business school, and
Mm.
everything they were saying was right. And I just could not get my head around it to understand, like, listen, business architecture is both. It's
Mm.
both, and that has definitely evolved. And in fact, when I talk to people, I often start with, listen, this is where the business architecture discipline has evolved to. It happened under, the radar of a lot of different people. So most certainly, Mario, it has evolved a lot. Yes.
Okay. So in that instance then, and you mentioned in your introduction, you built a business architecture function of around about 100 business architects. What are the key elements required to establish a business architecture function, both not just necessarily from a people perspective, but also whether the business actually needs it?
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Well, to your point about, does the business actually need it? That is the starting point. The
Yeah.
starting point is the why. It's not the models. Listen, the models can come. We can get the
Yeah.
capability maps and value streams. So, I think about, there are honestly two essential success factors,
Hmm.
or conversely, failure factors.
Hmm.
So the first success factor is continuous delivery of business value with business architecture.
Yep.
The second is, I've found, and I've also surveyed, with its strong partnerships and integration into the fabric of the organization. Now, sponsorship is the rocket fuel, that if you have those two things, it is unbelievable what you can do, and
Yep.
sometimes how fast you can do it. If you don't have sponsorship, if you have the first two, you can still get there. So that's the way to sort of think about the success factors, in terms of like what I'll say the formula for building a practice is to understand what BizArc is, obviously, but define your value proposition of business architecture for your organization, because I can give you things that work for other organizations, or we can speculate, but there's nothing like the crafting, positioning, and words for your organization. The second is to then, build the business architecture baseline, because listen, we do need an enterprise view of capabilities and value streams. So we're not really doing architecture. Step 3 is apply it to a usage scenario and continually, right? So actually show business architecture in action, get a win, build advocates, and then you go around and do it again. And then you find the next usage scenario, and we're building the business architecture knowledge base and the practice. So things like training, roles, tools, we're building the rest of the stuff just enough, just in time, in support of that business value.
And that leads me really nicely onto the next bit. So similar to enterprise architecture, well, similar to all architecture, really. Again, from my perspective, when things get tough economically, architects are the first ones to go, because they are seen as you don't do, you don't build software, you don't, build a data lake house for us, or, there's nothing actually that we see. So how can a business or an organization measure the effectiveness? And in your experience, are there any, I don't know, indicators, I'll call it a KPI or an OKR, whatever you want to call it, where you can say, by having a business architecture function, we have saved X amount of money, improved this amount of profitability? Because that's all really the board really care about. And I don't think you're trying to convince the CIO. CIO understands the value of business architecture more often than not. They've hired a business architecture function. The chances are they believe in it. That should be one sponsor. It's the people that they've got to convince. Why have we got this function that don't do anything? Kind of thing.
Yes. And you know what, if we are tracking those metrics and delivering on them, we're less subject to those changes. So you're right. This is an exact follow-on to what we were saying, because the way to measure business architecture is entirely correlated with the value proposition that you've defined, which is again why, this is really a $1 million question. People ask, how do we measure the value? And they sort of hope there's one metric, but there really isn't, because as I said, every organization needs to find their value proposition. So if it is, enabling end-to-end strategy to execution, as I was alluding to earlier, then we can, look at metrics like what percentage of the portfolio is strategically aligned. We'd assume that'd be 100%. It's not necessarily given. Or we can look at, time in the cycle, time from a finalized strategy, right, to a, portfolio or whatever point along there. Or if our business architecture practice is focused on simplification, on cost effectiveness, well, then we're actually adding up, the cost effectiveness. And what I found is this often ends up being some manual tracking, right? So it's things like, we found these applications were redundantly enabling this capability. How much was saved? Or this compliance fine didn't happen, but how much would it have cost? So that's the other trickiness with the measurement. Is you have to make some leaps there. The overall metrics that always apply, but you still have to do your measuring, is what I call ROBAI, return on business architecture investment. And to what you're saying, if we actually measure the impact of business architecture compared to salaries and tools and training, it's minuscule, because again, remember, if we can head off those execution challenges from happening downstream, absolutely invaluable.
It's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in most cases.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
Now, your forte is strategy to execution, isn't it? So, you've written a book on it. Why? And you would have done your research, obviously, by writing a book. Why do so many businesses struggle to make that leap?
It is a really good question. The statistics abound, and they continue to abound even over the years with all of our
Mm,
investments and strategic planning frameworks and agile frameworks and
yeah.
things like that. I think it boils down to a lot of things, but let me maybe share some maybe less commonly thought of ones. So first of all, I think part of the root cause is that we don't teach leaders how to do it in business school.
Yep.
So Graduate Business Curriculum Roundtable did a study some years back of graduate business curriculums, and almost none of them spend much time or specifically train people on how to turn strategy into actionable initiatives. We talk about formulation, we talk about leadership, change management, all good things, but we never really close that gap or even, bring people's attention that it's there. So that's one root cause.
Hmm.
But the second real big ones that I see, I think siloed structures, which of course is a function of organizational structures and things like that, motivation mechanisms, as
Hmm.
well as there's just such a tremendous bias for action in
Yeah.
organizations. It's like we'd rather get something done and done fast, and we don't care if it's the right thing or the 10th time we're doing it. If it's in my world and it makes me
Mm,
look good, and I always believe people are trying
mm,
to do the best thing for their organizations, but those silos and that bias for action, I think is a major root cause for these problems. We just and our organizations don't think enterprise. We're just kind of thinking siloed. And
yeah.
those things just don't always add up in the end.
And is that because of time? I think our architecture, is very much you've got to have a crystal ball. You've got to look into the future. You've got to protect us from scalability issues, performance issues, whatever it may be when it comes to software, for example. As you say, the average time or the average tenure of a leader now is between 3 and 5 years. So they don't really care if they've set up a really good architecture function or good strategy because they're not executing it. So is that why business or people in particular just think I just need to get this done, and that's why I don't need a business architecture function? And
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
pretty much.
I absolutely think that's part of it. And the leader turnaround, just as you described. And I also think that we're just not used to looking at our organizations as a whole or
Yeah.
thinking that way. And we're not rewarded that way. And there's also this theory of change that, listen, if you slow down in the beginning to make sure we're coordinated and doing the right things and connecting all the change, we can, like I said, head off the issues
Yeah.
later. People would rather deal with them later because of all these forces, like you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've had countless conversations on both on the podcast and confidentially as well around, well, that's where architecture has to sit at business level, at enterprise level, rather than within technology, which it often does. So okay, so how can businesses improve that then? How can they improve that translating the strategy into execution? We know why they can't do it, so how do they improve it?
Brilliant question. So some things we can do. It does start with intent and mindset, and actually in culture. So first is realizing that strategy to execution is an important muscle that all
Hmm.
organizations need. I would say it's the lifeblood. And,
Yeah.
for-profit organizations, it's competitive advantage because we can get our ideas to action, quicker than
Hmm.
others. And we can keep adapting to the world and the change that we started talking about in the beginning of the conversation. So it is realizing the importance of that. And it's also realizing, listen, we can do better because in this space, I find it's like, we're walking with a rock in the shoe. Like we just get used to it. We
Yeah.
don't even realize anymore that we can do better. We're like used to those bad
Yeah.
statistics. So intent. Another thing is, along with that culture, one of the best examples is an organization I worked with, Fortune 500 organization. The CEO started saying, everybody needs to be a good enterprise citizen. And that mantra changed leader behavior
Yeah.
tremendous, like within a week. So,
Yeah.
there are cultural things we can do from a process perspective. It's also looking at strategy, architecting changes, planning solutions. I'm not implying anything waterfall
Yeah.
here, measure success, right? But like looking at it as a process and knitting the teams together, because teams are often fragmented and the processes are fragmented. So saying, no, the process isn't this, it's this. And
Yeah.
then along with the process, accountability and transparency from end to end. And maybe one last thing I'll add, which Brian Cameron and I put in our book, The Execution Challenge, is that organizations should consider having these strategy execution disciplines reporting to one leader, because the accountability would be much better. Now, I've seen that work really well. For example, where an organization has a transformation office and they have all the disciplines reporting to them, but these are different ways to crack that nut. And one really practical thing to do, even though it's a harder change mindset wise, orient around capabilities.
Yeah.
If you orient around capabilities, they are enabling your strategy, they are shaping your work, they bring business ownership together across silos. So just the capability mindset and using them from strategy to execution can also help to bridge these gaps.
That cross-functional collaboration, as you say, isn't it? But I suppose how do you get different departments that are, number one, historically used to being siloed, but also have the mindset of that siloism, if that's a word, to start collaborating for the best of the enterprise? But how do you do that? Who takes the accountability for that?
Brilliant question. This isn't easy. This is like the root of the problem here, as you're saying. And as I always say, strategy execution takes a village. It takes all of those teams working together hand to hand. And, of course, the challenge is different accountabilities, different priorities, and many disciplines, architecture included, trying to prove our own value. So how you bring them together, again, I'm really big on intention. And I know it's very soft, but it all has to start there. And it has to start with the bigger why. The bigger why might be we need to execute strategy better for the obvious reasons. It may also, some other good impetus I've seen organizations have, customer experience, right? Or constituent experience. We have got to come together because we have to show up as one company to that customer, and we need to build seamless and consistent, non-redundant solutions and experiences for them. So having a motivator to bring them together, as I mentioned, if you have this formalized in a process, even an executive, well, there you have the muscle. But what if you don't? If you don't, ways around that practically are create a playbook, which is from strategy to execution, or your transformation steps, or however you want to look at that. What do all the teams do? What do they consume? What do they produce? Where do they interact? And the playbook brings them together. And there's, of course, nothing better than having all of those teams creating the playbook together. And in absence of all of that, I honestly think that business architects, enterprise architects as well, but I feel like business architects are kind of even have a broader reach here. They can be dot connectors to start bringing people together, because the business architecture is sort of the center of gravity of future state design as well.
And as you said right at the beginning, if all that fails, get a case study, go and do it with one part of the business. And I know that is silos, it goes against everything we've just said, but demonstrate a win. Then go and get another one, 2 or 3, and so on. And then all of a sudden, they all come together and you've connected the dots through success, right?
Exactly. Spot on. Spot on.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
We've spoken about interdisciplinary collaboration. What challenges do organizations, if it was easy, everyone would do it, right? But so what are the challenges organizations face? And what are, I suppose, the triggers that it's happening where leaders or the SLT or the board can go, that's not working well together, we need to fix it? What should businesses and leaders be looking for
to sort of fix these issues?
That cross-functional collaboration, if it's not happening?
If it's not happening, again, it's just literally at that level, believing that this is a function and
Yeah.
process that is important as any other, and raising it up to really to that level. I also think it's giving people I'll say the space they need and the tolerance to not not get swept away by the bias towards action, because part of, again, the slow down to speed up later as we're architecting changes up front, that does require hard thinking. And it's not just by, architects and designers, it's business. There's a couple of my favorite strategy sort of thought leaders that have pointed out good strategy formulation takes a lot of time and hard thought and accountability. It's part of why they say we end up with bad strategies. One of the reasons strategy execution is the same. Deciding what the target state is and what we actually need to do, and how, these things across the organization that are hitting the same capability, and how we design for that. We can also give space and time and changed culture to really appreciate that.
I think in our sort of previous discussions, you've called it like a partnership ecosystem, and bringing that together is architecture almost as the glue, right? So how can businesses do that bit? Treat architecture as the glue, because biased opinion, it is the glue.
It's the glue. How do we treat it as the glue? Exactly. So I think architects become dot connectors. And again, I see a lot of business architects doing that, enterprise architects doing that, because we take accountability and we see the big picture. We can't help but to say, here's the capabilities we're building. Like, how does this fit into the journeys? Or can we, it's just so, I think it's bringing people together. And as you stated so well before, finding opportunities in the organization to try these ideas out, even if we don't have wholesale approval, which is typically the case, right? We're sort of building the case. So I think it's the human side of it. And I do think, as I mentioned, I think business architecture in particular it's the scaffolding, it's the center of gravity for integrated design. And what I mean on that, as I've over the years really introspected, and as the discipline has been growing up, well, what does business architecture do that other disciplines don't, right? Because if we look at human-centered design, that's where we're getting our experience design. If we're looking at the people design, that's the organization design discipline, wonderful discipline. If we look at process design, that's business process management. If we look at data and technology, well, that's the IT architecture, right? The rest there. So it's like, what brings it all together? What is the keystone that locks it together? It's the capabilities and the value streams, the reusable business building blocks. So, it's actually those things that, like I say, knit that all together. The other way that architecture is glue is in the business, in the knowledge base, right? The architecture knowledge base, because we are connecting journeys to value streams. We're connecting capabilities to applicate. We're literally gluing it all together from a design perspective, and also the golden thread from strategy to execution. So you have, unpacked your whatever, goals, objectives, metrics, courses of action, value stream capability, initiatives, your solutions, so that if direction changes in our very fluid, disruptive world, it ripples through to the architecture, it ripples through to the initiatives in a methodical way. So all of those things are architecture as glue.
Yeah. Okay. So what practical, so that's a really good analogy around bringing, different parts of the business together to working towards one common goal. But what practical steps can organizations take to break down those silos and build a more, integrated and, as you say, intentional approach to transformation?
Yeah. Well, let's just take, let's start where we can start. If we are an architecture team, we can start by building our partnership ecosystem. And like I said, this actually is not only important for the organization, it's essential for architecture. It's one of the two critical success factors is partnership embeddedness. This also goes along with what you're saying, all of a sudden, people are trying to cut costs. They don't see the value of architects. When architecture and architects are embedded, that is much less likely to happen. So architects should inventory, right? Engagement model, inventory, who are all their teams, and be reaching out and developing close relationships with every other team and pulling each other in. And like you said before, finding scenarios that we're working together on. Hey, experienced design team, we're doing this over here. It's missing the experience. Come on in. Process team, we found some efficiencies and maybe some disconnects from a value stream perspective. Here's what needs to be optimized, and can you go deeper and get data and understand what's going on? So, from an architect perspective, it's reaching out, making that happen, and everything should be scenario, right, and value based, as we've been saying. But beyond that, it's and I'm being super uber practical here. The next would be, where can we get traction in a scenario in a set of teams? So I've seen, as I mentioned before, playbooks for strategy and architecture. I've seen playbooks for experience design and architecture. I've seen playbooks for BizArc process and business analysis. So whatever combination of scenario, perfect world, I would do it for all of business transformation, all of the teams. But if you don't get traction there, take your subset, prove success, and then go.
Okay. And over the next sort of coming years, how do you see the role of business architecture and enterprise architecture evolving?
Yeah. I wish I had a crystal ball on this one.
Yeah, me both.
Right. Yes, it's of course, yes. There's a lot of different forces. There's a lot of different conversations and communities, and I'm part of so many different groups that I can see a number of possible scenarios. I think from a business architecture perspective, part of what's going to drive this answer is what sort of traction, continued traction, does business architecture get as a strategic business discipline, enabling strategy execution and being used by non-architects and in particular business people and business leaders, because that's a force to the left side of my Venn diagram, right?
Yeah.
But I hope over the next years we only end up with tighter partnership, and all of enterprise architecture, with business architecture maybe as the tip of the spear, but all of enterprise architecture continuing to move or shift left in strategy execution, so that we're, teams aren't downstream in initiatives or solutions. Like, let's be up front when the direction is being shaped, and we can actually, shape the direction and the work in the smartest way. I do hope for that. In terms of the architecture profession, I continue to hope for a set of architecture competencies that bond us together. I talked a little bit about that in the beginning: architectural thinking, system thinking, applications, and then with specialization competencies. But I'm not sure if it's going to be business architecture and enterprise architecture still as this Venn diagram. I don't know. It'll be interesting where business and enterprise architects go. Yeah, not sure. But no matter what, we're still going to be collaborating closely, I hope, as partners and shifting left.
I can honestly see the profession as architecture, that's across IT solutions, what everything, business and enterprise, becoming more important, because I think as things like AI and automation and things like that start getting better, because they will evolve, I think the personality alone of an architect will become more important around, as you mentioned right at the beginning, that curiosity. How does it work? Do we need it? Is this right for our business? Whereas I'm not sure an engineer, again, without tarnishing every single engineer with the same brush, has the personality to go out to the customer service or the customer success department and say, right, what are we doing around customer success? Our goal is to make sure our customer satisfaction surveys are, our NPS score is 90 for whatever reason. How do we use AI to do that, et cetera, et cetera? I think that is where the role of the architect will become more and more prevalent at a technical level, obviously, and then that, I think, as a business architect, okay, well, these are our goals. Let's go and investigate this, etc., etc. I can just see that happening a little bit more. And yeah, what I'd like to see is a lot more junior architects come into the market and see it as a profession straight out of university, rather than having to cut their teeth in technology or projects or anything like that. Because I think that's where we'll get true business architects that
I
aren't
love
steered by technology.
I absolutely love that. And to add on to that, more women in architecture, right? We know there's a very low
Yeah.
percentage of enterprise architects in particular, more in
Yeah.
some of the other roles. And of course, there are amazing people around the world that are actually working to make this change. But like you're saying too, like our children should understand this is a career and that it's a pretty amazing career at
Yeah.
the forefront of, designing the organizations of the future. I love that.
You get to understand everything about the business that you're working with, and not only the business but the market. You can have to do analysis into what the trends are in the market and how the organization fits into that, and then how your department and so on. So yeah, if you're passionate about business, then architecture is the way forward, I think. But who knows? Wendy, we're going to move on to our quickfire questions. Any advice you wish you received earlier on in your career?
Me personally, to have confidence.
Yeah.
There were a lot of people, not a lot of people, but a couple people that really stick out that would be like, you're the only one that doesn't believe you can do that. So
Yeah.
I wish I would have gotten it to have confidence and know that, listen, nobody has all the answers. Nobody will ever have all the answers. We're human. We're never going to get right. We're never going to get it done. So just embrace the learning mindset, that growth mindset that you mentioned before, and just step into it. Yep.
Yeah.
Without having to know everything and do everything.
Yeah, one step at a time. What do you think CIOs or CTOs actually care about?
Good question. If I try to inflect my opinion on this, outside of maybe the bigger technology, cybersecurity, and obviously AI and all that, it's how do we continue to meet our businesses where they are, where they're going to be, where they don't even know they're going to be, and be able to move that fast and anticipate where they're going. As we all know, the speed, the disruption, the unexpected things that have happened in our world, from pandemics to geopolitics, they're unbelievable things we would have not predicted. So how do we actually keep supporting the business in an effective way now in the future?
Okay. And if you were to get an honest answer, no corporate politics or corporate head nodding or whatever, and you got the opportunity to ask a CIO or a CTO a question, what would that question be? And the reason I say CIO, CTOs is because architecture mainly, from my experience, reports into CIOs or CTOs, unfortunately.
Yeah. I would love to know their perspective on business alignment, and maybe even more specifically, what factors do you see that lead to misalignment of technology priorities and investments and initiatives? And how would you fix it? Magic one, how would you fix it? Because we know that's a lot of human and organizational stuff there. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. And lastly, this is purely from a talent perspective. What's the biggest change you expect to see in the architecture market over the next 5 years?
I would love to say lots and lots more strategic business architects. I think there will be more of that, but the biggest change, and I guess everybody probably says the same thing because it's AI, right? And where are there new AI specific roles, right? And where does the leverage of AI actually change our roles? And how do we really become more humans and better at the things we do so well? And how does the market sort of find those people, and how do we evolve into those people or get even better?
Okay, fair enough. Well, sadly, Whynde, we've run out of time. Before we finish, what would your question to the next guest be?
I love this. I'm going to listen. I would ask them, how can we continue shifting the perspective and the perception of enterprise architecture from a technical function to a strategic enabler of strategy, execution, and transformation?
Brilliant. Can't wait to hear the answer on that one. Well, we've finished. Thank you so much for a truly fascinating podcast episode. It's been really interesting getting under the skin of business architecture, how organizations can use it, and what companies can be doing to use it strategically. In the show notes, I'll put Whynde's LinkedIn URL so you can connect with her. and a couple of links of the stuff that Whynde's doing within the community and her website as well. So once again, Whynde, thank you so much for an excellent podcast episode and giving us your time today.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. All the best.
And that's a wrap on another episode of Transformational Blueprints. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found plenty of insights and takeaways to fuel your journey. If you enjoyed the episode, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could share it, leave a review, or give us a like. It helps us reach more people in the industry who can benefit from these conversations. Don't forget to follow Synaxia Group on LinkedIn to stay updated on new episodes. The links are in the show notes. Join us next time for more tips, strategies, and stories from some of the brightest minds in technology and transformation. Until then, take care and keep transforming.